I am glad to introduce the SMLQC seminar for today, where we will have as invited speaker Professor Pascal Friederich, that he will speak about machine learning for simulation, understanding, and design of molecules and materials. Before we start, I would like just to briefly mention what is the SMLQC seminar, what is our idea behind. So basically, it's a bi-weekly seminar given online, focused on machine learning and quantum chemistry, but not only, we also extended to include ideas from quantum computing. That is also, we have also seen many interesting applications related to machine learning and quantum chemistry. But maybe the most important difference compared to other seminars online is that we encourage our invited speakers to provide some tutorials with a hands-on experience where we can learn how to use different types of codes and also to get used with these new tools that has been developed by different groups. We also encourage young researchers that are mostly involved in these coding projects, postdocs and PhD, to also give seminar and present the most recent advances for us. So we have a group in Slack where we can keep discussing between these seminars and share codes and also recent papers that we take into consideration when we invite some speakers. But for those that want to just keep informed of the upcoming seminars, you can check our website for that. And the SMLQC seminars was also thought to make a bridge with the SMLQC symposia, where the first edition was in 2021, hosted by Professor Pablo Zhao in China, in Xiamen University. And this year we will have the next one that is hosted by Professor Roland Lindet in Uppsala University. And the idea is to, you know, that this machine learning field in quantum chemistry is evolving quite fast. So we decided to create the SMLQC seminar to keep people engaged and sharing experience between these 2 years of the SMLQC symposium. So again, if you want to know more, you can join our group in Slack or get more information in the website. And the videos of the first edition of this SMLQC symposium is already available in YouTube, so you can check in our channel as well. And I am very happy to be part of this group of organizers. So we try to put together people with different focus in this research of machine learning for chemistry. People that are working, some of them like Julia, for instance, so working with non-adiabatic dynamics, Professor Pablo Zhao in China working with different topics as well. So we try to cover many different areas of this exciting topic. And we already had 2 talks. The last one was given by me and the first by Arif. And we have already Professor Pascal to give the talk today, and some upcoming talks by Daniel Koda and Johannes Magraf. So you can check the list in the website. And now I don't want to extend too much, so I would like just to briefly introduce Professor Pascal. He has bachelor and a master in physics and also a PhD in physics focused on multi-scale modeling of organic semiconductors. Pascal received a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the Harvard University and the University of Toronto. where he developed research on machine learning methods for chemistry. And since 2020, Professor Pascal is a tenure track professor at the informatics department of the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. I hope I have pronounced it correctly. And leading the AI for material science research group. His group is focused on developing and applying machine learning methods for property prediction, simulation, understanding, and designing of molecules and material, as well as on interfacing machine learning methods with automated materials experiments. In 2022, Pascal received the Heinz Maria Leibniz Prize from German Research Foundation. So it's our pleasure to have you here today in our seminar. We are looking forward to see the results of your group. So now I will give you the connection. So please feel free to share your screen. I will just stop to share.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thanks for the invitation again to speak here at this seminar series. So give me a second, I'll share my screen. And I think you should see the screen now.
Yeah, we can see it, no problem.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So in the spirit of this seminar, I made my talk today a mixture of research results and also some sort of tutorial lecture style. So I'll try to keep the talk within the 30 minutes before we then go over to the hands-on tutorial. I hope you already received the link. If not, I'll share the link later again with you. So I'll talk in the first part today on machine learning for simulation, understanding, design of molecules and materials. And before that, I would like to quickly acknowledge all the great work that has been done, not by myself, but by the people in my group, who are basically both on the more computer science method development side, developing new machine learning methods, specifically then for the application side in material science and chemistry. And one of the big questions that are basically driving our research is how do we explore the space of compounds, of molecules, of materials. And that space is, I mean, there's a lot of different numbers, but like a rough estimation is 10 to the 60 small molecules could potentially be made that have properties that we could use for an application to solve certain challenges. If we think now about material space, that's probably orders of magnitude larger because we have more elements, not only small compounds, but complicated unit cell, amorphous materials, doped materials, and so on. So there's an insanely large number of potential materials. And the question is, how do we explore that? And the de facto standard is experimental explorations. We make molecules, materials in the labs, test them, and see whether they have the properties that we need for certain application. But the question is, can we speed up? Can we find better materials and molecules faster? And of course, computational tools can help here. So we can use computational screening methods based on physical equations, based on solving Schrödinger's equation, for example, using density functional theory or other approximations to predict materials properties, to predict them much faster than in an experiment. So we can screen for better materials faster, and we can even like maybe define design rules to design materials in a targeted way. And the question now, of course, is how can machine learning or data science help here? I mean, data-driven research is to some extent also, of course, computational, but it's a bit different than solving physical equations because we're depending on data and we learn whatever we can learn from data. Now, the question is, how can we use that to speed up that process? I would like to make 2 points here today. There's 2 directions how we can expect some gain using data-driven methods. One is data-driven methods can be they're very suitable to be used to exploit and avoid redundancies. So we only do experiments, we only do computations whenever we really need them. And through avoiding redundancies in the data, we get already a speed up, and that can help us accelerate the discovery of new molecules and materials. So this is relatively straightforward, and I'll show some use cases of that today. The other thing we can do is, and that's a bit more challenging, is we can use the machine learning models to uncover hidden relations in data. So we can try to use the machine learning models to basically learn the relations in the data, and then we can look into the machine learning models to see what they learned and whether we can basically find simpler underlying trends and underlying relationships in order to better understand structure property relations, for example, in molecules and materials, and then also use those to rationally design new molecules and better materials. And I'll also show some attempts in that direction today in my talk. So I'll start, split the talk roughly in two parts. The first part will be on how do we even do predictions using machine learning models in this case for chemistry, for molecules, and then how can we use those to speed up simulations. In this case, it's excited states dynamic simulations, which was a collaboration with the group of Stephen Lopez and his postdoc or his ex-postdoc Jimbai Lee at Northeastern University. So let me start with the first part. How do we use machine learning models now to do good predictions in material science and chemistry? If we think what we have on the application side, we have molecules or materials, and those are basically 3D objects. We have atoms that are arranged in a certain configuration in space. So we can think of a molecule or a material as a 3D point cloud of where each point is an atom, an element, and we have positions. And now we want to merge that or bring that together with machine learning methods. And then if we look on the other side, on the machine learning side, what we typically have are things like neural networks that can use input vectors. So we need some sort of vector representations to do certain predictions. But the question is now, how do we bring that together? I mean, we have the 3D point clouds on the one hand side, and we have vectors on the other hand side that's not directly compatible. So we need to think about how can we feed molecules as vectors, for example, into neural networks. And there's a lot of work on how we can find vector representations of molecules. But there's other very successful machine learning methods in different domains, for example, convolutional neural networks, which work very, very well on grid-like data, for example, on images, videos, and so on. So the question is, can we get some insight from that? Can we somehow bring that together? And the problem here is that the input that the CNNs were designed on were images. And on the left-hand side, we don't have images. We have some sort of 3D information, but also not on a grid, but in a continuous domain. So it's not that straightforward to merge that as well. And then also very successful recurrent neural networks and the follow-up, the transformer models that are currently discussed everywhere in form of GPT and so on. They're very good in working on sequence-like data, for example, on natural language, on audio signals, on text as input, in order to make sense of that and, for example, predict what is the next word and therefore generate texts. And these models are very successful, again, in this sort of domain on sequence-like data. But the question is, okay, they were not really designed for 3D objects, so it might be hard to make them compatible. And in order to solve that problem, that all of these machine learning models are not directly compatible with what we have, one of the solutions is we just make some new machine learning model that is directly working on the type of data we have, because that seems to be very successful for other domains, for example, images and sequences. And one of these possible solutions are graph neural networks, and this is what I will talk today mostly, and also show in the tutorial later how exactly that works. So graph neural networks, the idea is we don't fix the machine learning model to be compatible. We don't fix the data to be compatible with the machine learning model, but we rather fix the machine learning model to be compatible with the data that we have, which is point clouds. So we try to make a machine learning model that is directly working on the input as it is, meaning we have objects in space, atoms in space, and we try to process that type of information and do predictions based on that. So what we do is we represent every single atom that we have in our system, and that can be a molecule or a material, as a one point in space in a graph. And that graph, every node is now an atom, and every connection can be either like a chemical bond between atoms, or it can be the distance, for example, if we have 3D information between the atoms in space. And I'll show in the next couple of slides how technically this works, but in a nutshell, what we do is a two-step process. So in the first step, we learn not a representation, a vector that represents our whole material, our whole molecule, but we first learn every single atom representation every single atom that we have in the system. So we learn what is the local environment or the extended local environment of every single atom in our system. And then only in the second step, which is depicted here on the right-hand side, we merge all of that information into one vector and then use that to predict, for example, molecular properties of given molecules. As I said, geometry can be included, so we can either directly work on the structural chemical graph, so on the structure of the molecule, or we can directly work on the 3D structure and include, for example, distances between atoms, as here in this type in edge information. And graph neural networks currently reach state-of-the-art performance, so they're better than a lot of other models that were developed over the last decades. But here in the bracket, that's important only if we have large data sets. So if we talk about small data sets, there's still other methods that outperform graph neural networks because they add some more insight using, for example, handcrafted features that provide important information for the machine learning model to make its predictions. But once we have large data sets, and large here typically starts with roughly 1,000 or a few thousand molecules, materials in the data set, then typically graph neural networks start outperforming other machine learning models to do property prediction of molecules and materials. So how does this exactly work? So now we go on an abstract level for a couple of slides. So I said in reality, we have point clouds of atoms. Here now we think about this as an abstract graph. So this would be a graph with 4 nodes, 4 atoms. And we decide that this is the connectivity. I mean, this is not a molecule, but can be now thought of as a molecule. And we start by assigning a vector to every single node. So every single atom becomes some vector representation, and also every edge becomes a vector. Those are the gray vectors here and the yellow vectors for the edges. And we start by just informing the neural network about what is the very, very local information. So what are the elements in our graph, in our system, and what are, for example, the bond lengths or the bond types if we don't have geometry. So this is included in the information here in the first step. And what we do now, and this is the reason why graph neural networks are sometimes also called message passing neural networks, we define functions that send around messages between the nodes. So for example, we're now looking at that node here, and this node, which we call W here, wants to send a message to node V. And in every single step, every node sends a message to basically every other node that it's connected to. So there's not only one message, but a lot of messages sent around in every step. And that message here is now a function f at time step t. So this is happening multiple time steps. And this function is parameterized. That's why we have this parameter theta here, which is a whole matrix or parameter vector, or like an abstract notation of that there's parameters in this function that we can learn. And the function is a function of the state of the sending node, HW at time step t, and the edge that connects the sender and the receiver, which is the edge E from the receiver V and the sender W. And this function typically can be a small neural network, it can be a single layer neural network, it can be basically anything that we can parameterize and learn. And now we send multiple messages. For example, these 2 nodes are sending messages to node V, and then we aggregate over all the incoming nodes, because there's nodes that have 2 edges, 3 edges, 4 edges, and so on. So we need to somehow make sense of that arbitrary number of incoming messages. So for example, we can sum over all the incoming messages and then update the local state. So the receiving node is now receiving the sum of 2 messages. And then we define a new function, which is the update function, which basically, given the incoming message, MT, and the old node state, HV, at time step t, is updating to a new node state, HV, at time step t+1. And this, again, can be a small neural network. It can be anything that we can train that is parameterized. And now we don't do that only locally for one node, but we do it for all the nodes. So in every single message passing step, we are sending nodes from messages from every node to every other node, and we learn what are the useful messages to send and what are the useful functions to update the nodes, and then we can iterate that a couple of times. And after a couple of iterations, now we want to merge all of that local information that we learned, where every single node learned what are the local interactions with other nodes and so on. We want to aggregate everything into one global vector, which is here called the readout step, where we basically, for example, sum or mean over all the different nodes that we have in our graph in order to get this global vector G here. And from that, then we can use another neural network, for example, to predict the final label for that graph. This sounds super complicated now, like a lot of different neural networks, but we can in principle write that down or program that as one relatively large neural network that we can then now train in order to basically learn what are all the parameters that are going in all these functions. So what are the optimal parameters for these message functions? What are the optimal parameters for the update functions? What are the optimal parameters in that last neural network back here that are minimizing the errors, minimizing the differences between the predictions of that graph neural network and the actual label that we provide in the dataset. So we train it as one large end-to-end model that really directly starts with the molecule that we have or the material we have in its 3D conformation all the way to the final property. If you want to know more about how it actually works, what are different flavors of graph neural networks, there's not only one, but a lot of different architectures that do slight different variations of these functions, of how they're connected and so on. I would like to advertise here a review paper that we recently wrote. You can find a link here where we compare different graph neural networks, both for molecules and for materials, for a lot of different tasks, not only for property prediction, but also where we show applications for example, how can we use graph neural networks to screen molecules and materials? How can we use them for inverse design, to simulate systems? So for example, to use them in MD simulations, to predict the synthesis of molecules and materials, and also for gaining a better scientific understanding. And this is exactly what the last 2 points what I would like to spend the next couple of minutes on. I'll start with the scientific understanding, and then in the end, I will come to how can we use the graph neural networks to accelerate atomistic simulations. So one of the questions we were asking is, can we actually now learn something from what the trained graph neural network learned? And one of the problems is that most of the explanation methods are basically assuming that we first train a graph neural network or any machine learning model, and then we try to analyze and open the black box and see what did the model actually learn. And we wanted to turn that around to some extent, because this is very, in my opinion, not very logical. We as humans don't learn in that way. We don't get presented a lot of facts, and then we try to figure out what are the explanations, but we rather learn well if we get presented explanations, and then we try to use these explanations in order to make our predictions. In that spirit, we try to design a graph neural network that is slightly adjusted to what I just presented. So we add the explanations directly to the graph neural network. And explanations here are basically what, an explanation would be what part of a graph is responsible for a certain property. So if we have let's say a highly water-soluble molecule, then we can typically say a good explanation for high water solubility if there's a lot of OH groups, for example, or a lot of polar groups that can interact with the solvent. Or example, the opposite example would be if we have a highly non-solid water-soluble molecule, then we don't have a lot of polar groups. We basically can say, okay, there's a lot of let's say alkyl chains that are not water-soluble, and this is an explanation why a certain molecule is not water-soluble. So we wanted to include these type of explanations in our graph neural network. And this is a rather complicated chart. So what we have here in an abstract way in the upper half is what I presented already. So we have the inputs, which are the nodes and the connectivity. We have graph message passing layers here, in this case, graph attention layers. And then we have some sort of global pooling, which was the readout step before, and then some multi-layer perceptron, a small neural network to predict the output. But on top of that, we now introduced masks, and these masks are basically the explanations. So we say what part of a molecule is responsible for a certain property. And this is trained with the neural network and is not just analyzed as a post-analysis method. And the trick here is that the machine learning model, graph neural network, has to generate explanations, but then there's also a feedback loop. So the explanations are then also fed back into the global pooling step here using this arrow here. So if the model says, okay, this part of the molecule is responsible for a certain property, then we are forcing the model itself to also focus on that part of the molecule. So the explanations have to be in agreement with the predictions. So now let's look at the solubility example. We trained this model now on solubility. I mean, I should mention this. We trained it without having any explanations, but in principle, if we have explanations, we can also train the model using these explanations. So we have good intuition into what are the explanations for a certain label, we can as well tell the model also, okay, this part of the molecule is responsible for high water solubility or low water solubility. But in this case, this scenario here, we didn't do that. We only provided the labels and let the model figure out itself what are the explanations. And we get two channels. We get one channel that tells us what are explanations for low water solubility, and those are shown in the upper part here. And we get explanations from the graph network, what are the parts of the molecule that are responsible for for high water solubility. And we always show the same molecule in both channels. So for example, we see that this molecule here, which has this non-polar side group and the polar group part, has two very different explanations. So in the model figures out that this part, this long alkyl chain here, is actually responsible for like basically reducing the water solubility, whereas this more polar group here is increasing the water solubility. So overall, the label will be somehow an intermediate label. For this fused ring system here, we only have indications. We have only explanations. Okay, all of this molecule is basically responsible for low water solubility. Nothing in these molecules tells the model that there should be any high water solubility. So this will probably overall lead to a much lower label, much lower predicted water solubility than, for example, the last molecule here, where basically everything is in the channel for high water solubility. So we get a lot of additional insight from that model, still on the single sample basis, but we still, if we now look at not water solubility, but some property that is maybe not so intuitive to understand, we might get very, very interesting and insightful explanations by the model why a certain prediction is low or high. And then we can try to aggregate such explanations over the whole data set in order to find new knowledge about what did the model actually learn, and is there a causal relationship between what it predicts and what we can then learn from that and maybe also exploit in order to design better molecules. And here I am also asking you if you have any challenging, maybe also not so well understood molecular or materials data sets that we can use in the Blau-Eye model on. We did it in the past for a couple of different domains. So we looked, for example, into molecules for light-emitting diodes or LED molecules to understand what are the structure property relations there in order to make them better. We looked into generic tests like water solubility. But if you have interesting data sets where we have potentially a couple of, maybe 1,000 or maybe a couple of thousand molecules or materials, including the labels, it would be very interesting for us to test what does our model, first of all, say about how good it is in predicting these labels, but then also what does it say about the explanations that we can obtain here. So please reach out to me if you have any suggestions here. I'm very happy to see if we can train our models then on your data. With that, I would like to come to the last part, a bit shorter than the first part. I would like to show how we can also use the graph neural networks now to simulate molecular system. In this case, as I said, a excited states dynamic simulation. And this is all very, very strongly inspired by work of Julia Westermeier, who is also in the audience here today and in the organizer team. So I hope this is also very interesting here. So if we talk about atomistic simulations on a very abstract level, what it boils down to is that we need some tool, some engine that, given a certain 3D geometry, 3D arrangement of atoms in space, we have some sort of prediction of the energy. And once we have a prediction of the energy, we can get derivatives and get the forces, and then use these forces to propagate our simulation. And this can be solved on a lot of different time and length scales. So there's classical force fields that can be applied to very large systems, for example, proteins here to look at protein folding or other tasks. So we can apply to large system sizes, 10,000, 100,000 and more atoms, large time scales, but there are certain approximations in it. For example, we cannot easily simulate chemical reactions in classical force fields. For that, we need to go to more sophisticated methods, for example, reactive force fields, QM calculations, ab initio models, and so on. On the other side of the spectrum, we have, for example, ab initio MD, where in every single time step we do a quantum chemistry calculation in order to predict the energy, rather than the force field predicting the energy. And with that, we can then propagate a system and also look at more complex phenomena, for example, the excited state, lifetime of molecules, and so on. And in the last couple of decades, roughly starting in early 2000, 2005, based on seminal work by Baylor and many others. It was shown that we can basically exploit or like break out of this trade-off here. So we can train machine learning models, so-called machine learned potentials, then on the ab initio data. And they typically, if you train them with enough data, they reach more or less the same accuracy as the ab initio method, but at typically a speed up of a couple of orders of magnitude. This box here is intentionally not as high as the classical force fields on this Y scale here. So the machine learned potentials are still a bit more costly than classical force fields, which are very efficient in predicting energies, but still the machine learned potentials are significantly faster than the underlying ab initio method, for example, DFT or any other quantum chemistry method that they were trained on. And this is going back to what I said in the very beginning. The trick here is that we're basically avoiding redundancies. So if we couple that with active learning, and I will show later a bit how we can do that, we basically only do DFT calculations or quantum chemistry calculations when it's really needed, and when it's not needed, when we can interpolate nicely, then we rely on the machine learning method. So we can get that speed up to some extent just because we're having a method that really makes a good decision when to do a quantum chemistry calculation, when to rely on a basically fitted or interpolated machine learned potential. And that, of course, offers a lot of opportunity to be applied to interesting systems, complex systems in biology, chemistry, and material science. And I would like to now focus very briefly before I end my talk here on one application example where we looked at the photoisomerization mechanisms on relatively long timescales using machine learning photodynamic simulations. So we looked at two different reactions. One is a relatively simple system where we can still afford the full quantum chemistry trajectories as well. So we can compare how do the ab initio trajectories compare to the machine learned potential ones. And then I have one slightly more complex simulation a system here, that ring closing reaction, where it already got challenging to get a lot of statistics on the quantum chemistry side. And we were needed to heavily rely on active learning in order to explore the conformation space of that chemical reaction to see what are intermediate states, what are the outcomes, and what are the statistics. So first of all, we can look at simple statistics. We can look at, for example, a state population of the first excited state in the simple reaction here, and we can compare our quantum chemistry trajectories to the neural network trajectories, and we see more or less qualitative and quantitative agreement between both. So the method seems to work reliably and nicely. We can also look at the conformation space. So we here see for this first reaction, two reaction variables, two dihedral angles here. And we see a lot of trajectories, both on the quantum chemistry side and on the neural network side, that all start here in this upper corner here at high energy in the excited state. And then some of the trajectories here colored in blue go to the ground state in the trans conformation, and other go in the cis conformation here colored in red. And we also see and explore nicely the transition states here where the excited state goes from the excited state to the ground state colored in black. So we also see, again, very nice agreement between the quantum chemistry and the neural network-based potentials. We can, on top of that, get more statistics because we can run many more trajectories here on the neural network side. So we can also explore some rare events that we not really see on the quantum chemistry side to see whether those are either artifacts of the methods we need to fine-tune and retrain the method, or whether they're actually rare events that were just not really sampled here on the quantum chemistry side. So again, we can get interesting new insight into what is going on. On that slightly more costly or complex system here, as I said, we cannot run a lot of quantum chemistry calculation because they're just too expensive. So we started a couple of trajectories here, but we did not see all the expected reaction outcomes. So we only found this anti-4 conformer in the ground state, but we never found the SYN4 that was also expected from experiment. However, once we trained the neural network potentials based on active learning here to explore all of the relevant conformation space to train our model, and then we apply that final trained model to run a lot of trajectories of that system. We see all the expected experimental outcomes. We can even get some statistics of what are the ratios between SYN4 and NT4. And we nicely also explore the short-lived intermediate states here and all the transition states and so on. So we can again get a lot of insight into what are the reaction pathways of that chemical reaction, which was not easily doable using purely quantum chemistry-based workflows. With this, I'm at the end of my short presentation. So I showed you how we can use graph neural network for general property prediction, how we can interpret them and basically open the black box or even like train them using explanations in order to get better insight that can hopefully be used to design molecules in the future. And I also showed you how we can accelerate atomistic simulations using machine learned potentials in order to get better insight from a simulation perspective. With this, again, short thanks to all the people in my group who worked on these different projects. Thanks to the funding organizations for providing funding, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the very nice talk. It was quite nice to see all these possible applications of machine learning. So we are now open for questions. I guess there should be a lot of people interested to ask. Please feel free to mute yourself if you want to ask questions.
Hi, maybe I'm the first guy. Yeah. So, hello, hi, Pascal. This is a very interesting talk. In fact, I have some questions relevant to your graphic convolutional network. So sometimes I saw in chemical problem, we generally have two types of the problem. Either we will go to the chemical space. So it means you're trying to describe a different kind of compounds, different moleculars, okay? In the second example, you show some description on the same compound. So it means you built a potential energy surface. So sometimes I saw when the people started this two type of problem, they generally sometimes use different descriptor, sometimes use the same type of descriptor. So do you have some comments on what type of the descriptor should be suitable for the first type of the problem? What type of descriptor should be suitable for the second type of problem? So I'm quite curious on what the difference for these two different fields. I mean, and also, do you think you can really create a universal descriptor which can also suit for the first class of problem, also suitable for the second class of the problem? So this is my first question. The second question is, I think in the simulation of the dynamics, many people always emphasize you needed to satisfy some symmetry property like permutational symmetry, rotational symmetry. So in your approach, do you also, your descriptor also satisfies such a symmetry property? Do you also needed to consider this problem? So then the last question is also relevant to this non-adiabatic dynamics. So do you also consider fit non-adiabatic coupling vector? So that's all. I have totally three questions. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Very interesting questions and a lot. I tried to take some notes so I remember all the questions. Okay. So the first question was about that one type of data where we have a lot of different molecules, and not necessarily the geometry, and the other type of data is where we have a lot of different conformations of the same molecule over and over again. I think at the beginning, like a couple of years ago and longer ago, this was kind of really separate. But with the graph neural networks, you can in principle solve both tasks with more or less the same models. So the graph neural networks are relatively flexible in handling both tasks. You can even like think about mixed data sets where we have both a lot of molecules and of each molecule a lot of different conformers in order to do, for example, energy predictions. Of course, what you need is a model, for example, a graph neural network that relies or that uses the geometric information as an input. Otherwise, you would, of course, fail on the second task because the only difference is the geometry. All the molecules are more or less like from the chemical structure the same. They're just different in geometry. The real challenging question is if you go from the high data regime to the low data regime. So if you have only a few hundred data points or less, then I think you should like really consider having more specialized models that have descriptors for either one task. But what we currently see is that if we have a large data set with enough data, then basically similar models are very successful in both of these two tasks that you described. So it really depends on like that, on multiple dimensions. Like, what is the type of data? How much data do you have? How much insight also do you have in order to generate additional features? And if you don't have that, then the graph neural networks are a quite good way to go, to basically learn all the relevant features. So there are some models, for example, the SNET model that's very successful in both tasks. But of course, there's always models that then are specializing on one task more. But the tutorial I will show later will actually rely on the SNET model, which is apparently very good in both of the two tasks that you described. So many different graphs or many different geometries of the same graph. So you can solve everything basically in one model. Then the second thing was about the symmetries in the simulation. So there's a relatively large subcommunity of graph neural networks that is exactly focusing on that problem of the symmetry and also the invariances in graph neural networks. So there's something called invariant and equivariant graph neural networks that are exactly dealing with the fact that our molecules typically have like a translational and rotational symmetries. If we go to material science and we have, for example, periodic structures, there's more symmetries that we want to might want to take into account also for some molecules. I can send you a preprint that we just put online a couple of weeks ago, where we're also exploiting crystal symmetries in graph neural networks in order to have more efficient predictions for unit cell type of properties, mostly based on the materials project database, where we're basically exploiting the fact that all of these crystals that are in that database have certain symmetries, and we can basically tell the graph neural network to think about these symmetries when it does the predictions or become invariant to these symmetries. So equivariant graph neural networks can also easily take into account things like force predictions, coupling vector predictions, because they transform the input in a way that the output properties, which in this case are vectors or tensors, are rotating, for example, with the input. So you have an equivariant prediction, which of course invariant models cannot do. So with the invariant models, you cannot do a force prediction or a NAC prediction easily, because then your output would be invariant to the input, which of course doesn't make sense. But the NAC predictions, your last question, is actually quite challenging. So this is still open work. I already talked to a lot of people also here in the audience, Julia, Max, and so on, how we can solve that problem better. But I think there's no perfect solution, in my opinion, yet. So the NACs are harder to predict than the potential energy surfaces.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for your answer. Thank you. Yeah.
I think Johannes had a question.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Friedrich, for a very nice talk. I was wondering, I'm particularly interested in not in application of graph neural networks to atomistic properties, but more like learning the electronic structure directly. So instead of learning something about the potential energy surface, you go one level deeper and, for example, learn the charge density, which the difference is, instead of a scalar value per structure, you now have a mathematically speaking a scalar field. So you need, a priori, you need equivariance already, I think. And so far in this field, my understanding was that the traditional methods and the deep learning methods, or the graph neural network methods, are still more or less on par. I think, yeah, even a linear regression model will still outperform some neural network models with a few thousand coefficients instead of which uses some atomic cluster expansion type of representing the density, as opposed to like grid-based neural network models which use millions of weights. So I was just wondering, do you think that this field will go the same way as did the machine learning potential field, that now deep learning has won, and there's or is there still a place for these other methods? Because I mean, thousands samples, as you said, is not much, and especially for a computational field. Or will everything be graph neural networks in the future? And the second question would be, everyone uses PyTorch, and your graph neural network library uses TensorFlow. Why? Okay, yeah, thanks.
Sure. Thanks for these questions. I mean, the first question, I have to say, I'm not an expert in that field. I'm not part of the community that tries to look into the electronic structure properties, so it's very hard for me to make a very informed statement here.
Okay, then perhaps just this general question of use. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think deep learning is not always the answer to everything. So I think generally you can say that it's very likely that you will not like solve all the problems with it. I'm not sure if graph neural networks are the most suitable tool here to use if you want to predict electronic structure, because then you're, as you said, not talking about atom-centered or molecule-centered properties, but more or less like a continuous field of electron density and so on. There's certainly approaches, but as I said, I'm not an expert in that, so it's very hard for me to judge what are like the developments right now and what is the most promising tool. Regarding the question about a library, our library more or less started as like a internal project because we just wanted to see how exactly it works. A couple of years ago, we decided then to publish the library. And one of the reasons why we decided to publish it, I mean, I'm aware like most of the things are published in PyTorch Geometric or other PyTorch-based libraries. What we saw is that just because they are published in the same package doesn't easily make them fully reproducible. So very often we saw that like we just downloaded the repo, tried to reproduce what was written in the paper, and we didn't succeed. So we didn't get the same mean absolute errors as reported in the paper. So what we decided to do is have really like a nice benchmark library where we have the models implemented and only implemented if we reach exactly that accuracy. So most of the models that you can find in our library, if you train them on the original data set, you will more or less get exactly the same numbers as promised in the papers. So we tried to basically reproduce exactly the numbers in the papers and not just directly implement whatever was implemented in the GitHub repo of different groups, because sometimes there were layers missing, sometimes the hyperparameters were different. So we tried to have like a standard, and I thought we shared with the community. And because we work on it a lot, we also implement our own stuff in it. But we're also doing internally PyTorch models, so it's not like we're only doing TensorFlow. But
this makes a lot of sense. Okay, yeah, now I understand better. Thank you.
Okay.
Do we have more questions? I would like to make one question, maybe a naive one. So if I understood well, the idea of the convolution in graphs, the convolutional layers for graph, is to generate some sort of embedding that contains a good representation for that particular system, right? So I was wondering if this kind of embedding could be used in the sense of unsupervised learning, for instance, to have like a better representation, and eventually when you do not have labels available, you can use this sort of improved representation to apply in the context of unsupervised learning. Do you know some application of this in the case of chemistry and material science? Could you please comment on that?
Yes, there was quite some research activity in the last couple of years on transfer learning for graph neural networks. I mean, it's very, very successful in computer vision. For example, all the CNN models that I mentioned in the beginning, they can be trained on a large data set that's relatively generic, and then the representations can be applied to a data set where we have very few labels. Unfortunately, for the graph neural networks, it doesn't seem to be that easy. So as you said in your first sentence, you learn representations that are very specific for a given task. So you kind of don't learn a very generic representation of the molecule that can then be adapted to other other tasks, at least not just out of the box. So there's a couple of papers. I think there was one on NeurIPS last year, and other papers. I can find out some for you that try to test more or less in a systematic way how you can use graph neural networks for transfer learning. But I think it currently doesn't work out of the box. So if you just if the tasks are very similar, maybe, but if they're very different, then it typically doesn't work. But in principle, it doesn't mean it never works. So there's also some ways around it, but you have to think more than in computer vision, for example.
So do you mean that the embedding vector that you get at the end, it's kind of related to the learning task that you have? So
very often very related to the learning task that you have. You can still try to use transfer learning to retrain them on the smaller data set, but it's not always transferable. Okay.
And just a more naive question. So I saw that you showed in one of the slides that you have those different vectors that you aggregate somehow. But if you have a data set that contain molecules of different size, how can you get at the end one vector that is a fixed size in this case?
I mean, the global readout function or the global aggregation function is typically it has to be a function that can take arbitrary amount of inputs and provide one output. So it's typically something like a mean or sum operation, which of course, again, you have to think about what is a good aggregation here. If you have intensive versus extensive quantities and so on, you want to think about what is a good choice here. So the choice of these aggregation functions and so on has to be well aligned with the task that you have.
Then the aggregation function can also contain learnable weights.
There are aggregation functions that contain learnable weights, but very often it's just something like a sum or a mean.
Okay.
So the learnable weights are typically before, in the message passing, and after, meaning in the from the vector to the final property.
By the way, I think I have a good data set to test the explanatory model. Yeah,
let's talk more.
It's a very nice data set. I can tell you later about that.
Great, thanks.